Hello, and welcome to our online lecture. This is part one of two, and the topic for these lectures are Reagan culture wars and recent American history. As we go through some of this, it may sound a little bit familiar in terms of looking at some of the issues of the 60s and 70s, as well as the backlash against the progress made in the 1960s in terms of federal legislation and attempts to open up society. So you can certainly think about Reagan's presidency in 1980 as representing this backlash. If Trump in 2016 represented a backlash against the progressive ideas of Obama, then the same thing is happening in the 1980s. As we go through this, you might also find a lot of parallels between Reagan and Trump, and you should highlight those, because not only does Trump implement many of the similar policies as Reagan, he uses the same campaign slogan as Reagan did in 1980, which was "Make America Great." So all that taken together, hopefully you will find parallels, as that's really one of the goals. You should also consider whether or not these culture wars are still going on, and I would certainly argue they are. And you're experiencing this in your own time. All right, so to begin, one of the specific ways that we can demonstrate the backlash against the progressive ideas of the 1960s, or rather 1960s student movements that are attempting to open up society, is through the women's movement. There had been a substantial women's movement in the United States since the 19th century. The women's movement certainly included African American women throughout, and yet the women's movement had also been supported by wealthy white donors. And this created issues within the women's movement from the 19th century even till today. But in the 1960s, the real focus of the women's movement in terms of opening up society was to provide women with equal access to the same things that men had access to, in terms of education, in terms of construction of family, as well as access to employment. And these are sort of the three main issues of the women's movement of mid-century. If the early part was the right to vote, then mid-century is education, family, and employment. And one of the things to know was the issue of domestic violence. In the 1960s, basically you could beat your wife close to death, and it was not really considered a crime. Killing your wife would be a crime, but beating was still very much within the parameters of the law. And so domestic violence was also one particular issue that got brought into the forefront of this discussion in many ways that it had never really been amplified like that before. Certainly, the issue of women's rights to control their bodies, reproductive freedom, as well as sexuality, is also becoming much more of a national conversation rather than just private conversations between women. Up until the 1930s, women did have access to abortion in terms of there were no laws restricting it. So in the 1960s, women had only not had access to abortion for about 30 years. And this, of course, creates a whole host of medical and public health problems, but particularly medical problems for women. One specific organization that helped to sort of focus attention on women, both politically, socially, and economically, was the National Organization for Women, or NOW. It was organized in the early 1960s by Betty Friedan, who very much articulated the lack of access to education, family, and employment that most women experienced. She also, as a member of NOW, advocated that the organization not affiliate with any political party, but rather work with people, politicians, and at this time they would have been almost exclusively male, who could help their agenda. So that's certainly going to change over time as once abortion rights are legal, one of the central galvanizing issues of Republicans and conservatives is to make abortion illegal again. All right. Other issues that we see attributed to women's rights or the economics of raising a family and the elusiveness of the American dream. For most families, increasingly the changing economics of the 1960s, including the expensive Vietnam War, was having a real effect on how people were living, and many women were going back to work also out of economic necessity. And another issue associated with women's rights was affirmative action. Affirmative action in terms of access to education, certainly employment, and in every facet of social life. I don't know how many of you played, how many women in the class played college sports or sports in high schools, middle school, but that is also very much a direct product of the women's movement. Title IX, which guarantees women and girls equal access to sports and other types of resources, was enacted in 1972. Fundamental, of course, to shaping not only the rest of the 20th century, but well into the 21st century, was the Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade. There's a number of things to say about this particular case in terms of the title of the case, as well as its broader implications over time. But Roe v. Wade is the court case where the Supreme Court ruled that women have a right to privacy in determining the reproductive future of their bodies. And ever since that, there has been a fight to either augment it, reverse it, or change it. So there's never been a time in American history where Roe has really just allowed to be. And secondly, it has become one of the central mechanisms of which to galvanize conservatives, and that has remained truthful for over 40 years. All right. Throughout the 1970s, and certainly well into our own time, we're going to see women becoming much more involved in politics, certainly from women like Shirley Grisham, and all the way to contemporary women in politics. We also start to see issues, a sort of change in rhetoric between women's rights to women's liberation. And women's liberation, and the concept was a bit different. Women's rights was about gaining access. Women's liberation was much more about critiquing the system of American society that was based on patriarchy, also racism, classism, that there had been these systemic forces that oppressed women. So women's liberation really spoke to that rather than sort of the need to reform the system, right, which is basically what the women's movement is arguing. One specific person that came associated with this issue of liberation was Gloria Steinem, who helped to found Ms. Magazine, which was one of the first feminist magazines, and is supportive of the cause of liberation, which, of course, as you could imagine, these women are going to face a conservative backlash. You have probably noticed within, again, the context of your own lives and the Me Too movement and women coming forward, that when this happens and when you see a concerted effort of women claiming power, that there is a backlash against this. And history, again, provides a critical lens as to how we see this before. So think about the dates for this conservative backlash, right? This is occurring right during Vietnam. It's occurring really at the height of student-led civil rights. There has now been a very, by 1965, Martin Luther King has been a visible figure in the United States for nearly a decade. Within that time, he's advocated nonviolence and yet experienced overwhelming state-sponsored violence living in the South. By 1965, the U.S. is becoming embroiled in Vietnam, and we start to see, again, the cost of the war having a real impact on the economics of living in the United States. By 1965, we will see other groups such as SNCC, the Atlanta Student Movement, active, mobilized, registering voters, attempting to create a second American Revolution in the United States, one based on equality. And many students are sounding very radical, sounding very revolutionary. Again, we're seeing some semblance of this in our own time. So as you experience backlash to particularly younger people talking about progressive ideas, we can also see that this was the same conversation being had between the youth and the older generations in the 1960s. So all of these things are helping to create this conservative backlash. And in many ways, we never really come back from this. But we'll talk about that part in a minute. All right. So we can sort of chart this backlash in a number of ways. And again, I just wanted to point out this title right here, American Socialism, Moving America Downhill. So this is a pamphlet that is published in Oklahoma, but by a Christian conservative publication. In 1965, Christians are certainly around, but they had not been voting, really. There was sort of a decades-old belief that Christianity and politics don't really go together. And certainly this is going to change, right? So this conservative movement that's going to be led, even the 1960s, is led by evangelical Christians. And again, they really make up the base for Donald Trump today. So consider that as we go on. There is, again, a number of ways we can sort of chart the backlash. One is obviously in assassinations, which isn't up here, but it's worth mentioning, right? There are numerous assassinations throughout the 1960s of civil rights leaders, as well as other political figures. So that is a demonstration of backlash. There is also changes in terms of the law. In 1978, or rather 1976, Congress is going to pass the Hyde Amendment. So if Roe v. Wade is passed in 1973, only 3 years later, the Senate passes an amendment to Roe, which basically says that abortion cannot be funded through Medicare. So this is really going to limit access as well, saying if a woman needs an abortion, she cannot use Medicare services and Medicare monies to pay for it. That is still very much in play today. Also in 1978, the court ruled in terms of Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. And in this was a challenge to affirmative action, saying that quotas in college admissions were unconstitutional. So again, we can start to chart how we have a different court by this time, a much more conservative court, and they are looking at these issues potentially in a very different way. In 1978, we also have this intersection of religion and politics with media. And what I mean by this is there was an organization called the Moral Majority. And these are very conservative Republicans who want access to media. And they really want to use the media to galvanize Christian voters. So they're going to have radio stations, television stations, and really start to formulate broadcasting that has not only a Christian message, but a politically driven message as well. And they're going to be quite successful in terms of creating a generation of supporters. It's at the same time in the 1970s that we start to see a shift in the political identity of Southern Democrats. And I want to show you this, right, which is the 1980 presidential election map. So hold on just a second. To illustrate the point. So this is the 1980 presidential election map. And as you can see, right, the solid South that had once always been Democratic is no longer. It is now has flipped red. The only state that votes for a Democratic candidate in 1980 is is Georgia. And they vote for Carter because he is from Georgia. So this map really tells an incredibly interesting story of what had been, right, the Democratic South, which is now becoming overtly Republican. So that is that part that I wanted to show you. Okay, so there's a change in political affiliation in the South, and this is creating, again, a Republican South, and you also start to see other whites leave the Democratic Party in the North as well. So this is going on nationally, of course, too, as you can see by the map. So what's driving all of this backlash in terms of beliefs, right? So in the 1960s, not only do we have federally mandated integration, but you also have the idea of expanding the federal government to really solve problems. Johnson not only declared a war on Vietnam, but he also declared a war on poverty. And he argued that the weight of the federal government could be used to really help people. It really sounds like a great idea, but it's an expensive thing to do if you're also funding a war. So between the war and the social programs, Americans also saw a rise in taxes. So there's also going to be a backlash against the idea of social safety net because of that expense. And that debate still rages on. And this is really where it comes from. But there are a lot of other things in the 1960s that were being debated. One is creationism. Should there be prayer in school? The role of the family, the idea that the American family was under attack by, again, changes in society. Many conservatives obviously supported the Vietnam War, supported the idea of America being strong on defense, America as a global power. Again, sort of the same issues, right, that we would identify today are here in the 1960s. And it seems like we've been sort of well into this place for decades now. I want to sort of highlight some of these conservative leaders for a number of reasons, because many of them will hold power in the government, many of them will hold power in the media, and you also see the sort of face of the anti-feminist movement led by a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. So let's start first with Jerry Falwell. You may be familiar with his name. Jerry Falwell was one of the organizers of the Moral Majority and also a televangelist. He, in 1974, made this very public comment in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade. He said, quote, "I listen to feminists and all these radical gals. These women just need a man in the house. That's all they need. Most of the feminists need a man to tell them what time of day it is and to lead them home. And they blew it, and they're mad at all men. Feminists hate men. They're sexist. They hate men, and that's their problem." End quote. So, this is the religious, evangelical, white response to women who are asking for equal rights, equal access, equal pay, as well as certainly criticizing the larger, broader culture. So Jerry Falwell and other conservatives, right, are reacting to the changes in culture, such as more sexual content in popular culture. That becomes an issue. Access to birth control also becomes another rallying point. There was a belief that America had sort of lost control of its youth, which is certainly something that you hear today. Conservatives are going to argue that diversity was a negative in the United States, that diversity was creating conditions for divorce, for gay rights, all of those things. And they argued for what they called a new traditionalism, which was, in their mind, a return to family values. So, again, a lot of similarities to our own time. Politically and internationally, there was also a sort of national belief that the U.S. had lost its position in the world. And this is certainly something that Trump spoke about in his criticism of Obama and in the years leading up to the 2016 presidential election. He continuously makes the comment that America looks weak, right? That we're a laughing stock. Those are some of the terminology that he uses. And there was a very similar criticism made by conservatives in the post-Watergate era of the 1970s, that America had lost its way, that America was no longer led the world, and that all of these things which had happened, including Middle Eastern nations becoming independent from colonial rule and not allowing other countries to dominate the oil market, right? That became something. The economics of the time had created, by the 1970s, a downturn in the economy with high inflation. This was known as stagflation. You also have a big slowdown in the industrial economy in the 1970s because of other global factors. In the late 1970s, as we talked about in the earlier lecture, United States Americans are taking hostage in Tehran. So all of these things certainly help to create the popular idea that America had lost its strength. And it's important to know this because part of, again, why Reagan wins in 1980, as well as why Trump wins in 2016, is that they start to really talk about how they are going to bring back American glory, restore American power, American values. And so in 1980, you had a sort of interesting example of a non-politician. He had been a governor of California during the 1960s, but before that, Ronald Reagan was an actor on TV and in Hollywood, and made some pretty terrible movies. He, as governor of California, he was very anti-civil rights. He very much goes after the Panthers. He is a protector of what he calls economic rights. So when he goes on the national scene in 1980s, he does have name recognition in a way that is very helpful for him, but he also has a history of being a very conservative socially, economically, and in every way. As leader, there are a number of things that people would point out as sort of contradictions within Reagan's image. But Reagan very much was carefully crafting a image. He wanted to restore the U.S. in terms of power. He wanted to renew the Cold War. And unlike other presidents, he really wanted to end or argued to end the Cold War and to win it. And that's a big change in rhetoric compared to other presidents before him. He very much played on patriotic symbols and sort of the mythology of the American past, and wanted Americans to feel good again. Again, so many similarities to the types of things that Donald Trump campaigned on. As president, he is going to transform the taxes and create a Reagan-era tax cut, very similar to what Trump just did. And in so doing, he ups the budget. The Department of Defense, that's the military, their spending goes up 45%. He argued for economic policy known as the trickle-down theory, in which you give the top 1% basically a huge tax break, and then the wealth will trickle down to everyone underneath them because they are creating jobs and investing in the economy. Throughout this time, this hasn't seemed to work, but people continue to repackage it and claim that it does. Under Reagan, we see the U.S. debt skyrocketing. You also see rising profits of Fortune 500 companies. At the same time, more Americans are considered working poor rather than middle class. Interestingly enough, I heard a study today talking about the widespread poverty within communities around the United States. And I mean, widespread poverty all over. It's the one thing that unites American communities, in fact, is that so many people in America are poor. There was a decline in real wages and increase in household debt. Now, at this point in time, this debt is not student loan debt because that does not really exist yet, which means college is still very unaffordable for most people. However, private colleges, state colleges were not, and community college also wasn't. There was a much more sort of affordable track, but again, for most people, unless you have access to money or had some sort of scholarship, you would go to community college, if that. Throughout this process, again, the sort of social issues of obesity and medical problems are not things that take a lot of attention of the Reagan administration. And I say this because there is a growing epidemic of American children becoming obese. And in response to that, Reagan says, well, ketchup is a vegetable, right? Like, ketchup is there, which, of course, ketchup is nothing but sugar. But it just sort of speaks to the callous nature of what it means to really look after some of your most vulnerable citizens, which he, really wasn't into. What Reagan was good and very good at was to really talk about a sense of class. Let me rephrase. What Reagan was very good at was to place these dim times within a beautiful frame. Just sort of like today, you would hear him discussing how people are profiting off the stock market, the economy is doing well, and although it was for wealthy people, the majority of Americans were facing a changing economy that was based off of the end of factories. The 1980s is the era where factories start to move abroad in record numbers. And you may have seen how this works within your own hometowns, but if a factory leaves that employs hundreds, if not thousands of people, this will have a direct impact on people in terms of their access to jobs, moving out, creating a sort of rapid decline in the entire economic ecosystem. So that's happening, and as you can see, the numbers are quite startling. 1 million people had lost their jobs by 1982 because of closing factories. And again, these factories are going abroad. You also have Reagan and other conservatives going after unions and getting rid of unions. And unions in the United States was critical for achieving middle-class wages, middle-class access, and middle-class wealth that can be handed down to the next generation. So that's also changing. Unions also lost millions of members. And when that happened, they also lost their ability to have a lot of political influence. What you see happening, right, is that the federal government is now flipping its support of people, right, and giving that economic support to corporations, corporate welfare instead of human welfare. And that's really one of the major impacts of the Reagan era. Reagan also had scandals, one of the most significant being the Iran-Contra scandal, which is fairly involved. But what you should know is the United States is going to sell weapons, use that money illegally to fund an anti-communist movement in Nicaragua and throughout Central America. And this is illegal for a number of reasons, but it also hopefully is going to demonstrate that the contemporary unrest also in Central America is linked to the Reagan administration, the Cold War, and U.S. involvement. So that's something else to know. This is going to be the place that we stop for part 1, and then the second part will pick up right here.